Okay, guys, good morning. Let's get started. Um, so let's take a look at the focus question. How did America's impact in World War I help lead to an Allied power victory? So at this point, we know from the Zimmerman telegram that America enters the war. We spent the last 2 days really looking at the weapons and the fighting. And so now we're actually going to just look at one day, like how some of the American battles took place, because World War I is a war that takes place over 4.5 years. America's not really in it for that long. So this is a much bigger war when you learn about in world history in 10th grade. Um, but we do obviously have to talk about America's impact and some of the battles that we ended up doing throughout this time. So you should have the focus question down at this point. If you don't, then you go back to the YouTube later and obviously get it. But let's see how America's impact in World War I is a big difference and how that helps lead to an Allied power victory. All right, so I'll give you a minute to copy this down before I start going over it, but please take a look, copy down what's in red. I know it's most of it, but we have to kind of talk about how America really impacts World War I. Okay, so first things first, America enters World War I in 1917. Um, but we actually don't fully send troops until May of 1918. Okay, and I'll kind of talk about why, because this is such a big war. You can't just like enter the war and just start sending soldiers over there. You need to get prepared. You need to what's called mobilize. And what that means is you need to get your soldiers ready and you need to get your weapons ready. So we've already talked about how there was a military draft, so we had to start drafting soldiers. We had to train those soldiers because you need to make sure that they're properly prepared as possible. But it ends up being a situation where we do send troops, but not until May of 1918. So almost like 8 or 9 months before we enter World War I. And this is because we're just getting ready to go. Okay. Now, this is something we'll talk about in the next unit, but I want to mention it for now because it does obviously have to do with World War I. A huge thing you'll learn about in world history is something known as the Russian Revolution. This was a situation where the people of Russia basically revolted, okay, against Russia's government. All right. And what they did was they overthrew the leader in charge. His name was Tsar Nicholas II. They overthrew him and actually killed him and his family. And then they put in a new government and changed the name of their country. Okay, they changed it to the Soviet Union. We will learn more about this in the Roaring Twenties, why it ended up happening. But what you need to know for now is Russia had to leave the war. And this leaves the Allied powers in a serious disadvantage because they're losing one of their strongest countries. Okay, a big reason why they end up leaving and is not just the revolution, but also that they are the #1 country in deaths. So they had a lot of people die, a lot of soldiers died during this war, and a lot of people, I guess, were sick and tired, okay, of all the fighting when basically Russia had enough problems of its own at home. So they left World War I. Right around the time Russia leaves, this is when America gets involved, and it's a huge, huge help. All right, because the Allied powers really were struggling because they've been fighting for about 3 or 4 years. They lose one of their biggest fighters, and now it seems like it's not in a good situation. But America does join kind of just in the nick of time to help out the Allied powers and help win World War I. The first major American battle included what's known the Battle of Belleau Wood, which is in June 1918. So the battle is in France, and America is going to join up with the French, okay, to stop Germany from advancing through France. So Germany kept moving forward. They were trying to advance into France and take more of France over. America did lose a ton of soldiers, but were able to stop Germany from advancing any further. I'm just going to show you a quick photo of what that battle kind of looked like here. What you'll notice is we spent a lot of the last 2 days looking at trench warfare. Well, you should notice here, this is not a trench warfare battle. This is just an open battle in the forest. The Germans had actually left their trenches to try and advance forward because Germany was running out of time. And this is a battle that took place in the woods, hence the name Belleau Wood. Okay, understand America's impact is huge because, I mean, just think about this logically. Picture fighting someone, you physically fighting someone. Let's say you fought them for like 15, 20 minutes and you're just worn down. You ever see a boxer at the end of a match? Now, what happens if you have to fight someone brand new who's completely fresh? This is America in World War I. It's not necessarily that we had the best army, though we do have a very good army. We just came in at a time where all the other countries are just like decimated. They've been fighting for 4 years. They're very low on troops. They're very low on supplies. And here comes America with all these troops, all of these supplies. All right. America lost many soldiers throughout this battle, but they could afford it, as weird as that sounds. It's horrible to say that. They have a lot of soldiers at this point, so they could afford losing some. All right, where maybe like Germany and these other countries really can't. You know? The second and final major battle in World War I now, there's tons of others. All right, but the second and final major battle, at least that we're copying down, is known as the Battle of Argonne Forest, okay, which was in September of 1918. So let me just first show some photos of that before I go on. You see the trenches for the ones that America made throughout this battle? They're like little holes in the ground. These aren't really trenches. These were just temporary trenches, they were called. They were just a quick way to hide, okay, in the ground, because America really doesn't plan to stay there for more than a few hours. Okay, so you can see that these trenches are a lot different. And this is barely even a trench here on the right. It looks more like just hiding behind a stack of wood. Okay, it's not even a real trench. But this was a more traditional, trench warfare battle. Okay. And the second and final major battle. So basically, what is crucial about this battle is America stops Germany from advancing in June 1918, but now they start to push forward and actually break through the German defenses. Okay, what took the France and the Allied powers almost 3 or 4 years, when America gets involved, it doesn't take too long relatively. The battle was 47 days long. And once they finally break through the German defenses, it all but ends World War I, because now you basically have the Allied powers invading Germany, and they can't handle that. All right, they've been fighting for too long. What you'll notice about World War I is, okay, I know we already talked about this earlier on in this class, but basically Germany is the main fighter for the Central Powers. If you can take care of Germany, you're going to take care of the rest of the countries in World War I, because they're by far the strongest. Okay? All right, so I'll give everyone another 10 more seconds to finish copying this down, and then we have one more much smaller slide before we get into today's assignment. And if you're watching on the YouTube, obviously you could just pause the video. Okay. So this is the last slide. Please copy down what's in red. So America's impact in World War I. So we already kind of talked about this. America provides a resurgence of troops and supplies and ultimately morale. I mean, what it means is a morale booster is they're a new group to fight for the Allied powers, and they could use that type of feeling that the Allied powers need at this point. To break the stalemate and tie in favor an Allied powers victory. Okay, the Allied powers do win, so that means Britain, France, America, and all the other Allied powers do win World War I. okay, which is a great thing. Now, there's two major groups that don't get enough credit. America is led by two major heroic groups that I just kind of want to mention. One was called the American Expeditionary Forces, but I just know them as the AEF, which is them here on the top right. You can see them putting on their gas masks, for the trench warfare and the chemical warfare. That's something that we've already talked about last time. You see the gas masks that they're putting on. And the other group was the Harlem Hellfighters, whose actions throughout this war made them heroes. Okay, the Harlem Hellfighters are so basically, you just need to remind you, our country's still going through segregation. That means our military in both World War I and World War II will be segregated. So you notice this here, AEF is a very white group. This is the very black group. Okay, they were segregated. Even though they fought for American sides, they were segregated. What's particularly interesting about the Harlem Hellfighters is I should mention they've actually very much fought alongside with France, and the French government actually gave all of the Harlem Hellfighters their highest military honor for helping them throughout battle. So these were very skilled, very good fighters, and a lot of them came from Harlem, New York. Right? Not all of them, but that's where the group kind of started out of. All right, so these two groups are very big, okay, and these two groups were very helpful in winning World War I. All right, they were these special military groups that during World War I they used. Okay, get ready for a question in the chat. Be ready to answer, please. Hopefully you guys are all with me and not sleeping. So the Central Powers realized they will lose on October 4th, 1918. So they contact President Wilson and a couple of the other leaders from the Allied powers who's going through at this time, and they sign what's known as an armistice or a ceasefire. And it was officially signed on November 11th, 1918. And what that means is they're going to stop the fighting, okay, ceasefire, until a treaty is signed. Now, you'll learn about the treaty tomorrow, but something is interesting about that date, November 11th. Every November 11th, we celebrate a holiday. All right, does anyone know what that holiday is called? What holiday do we celebrate on November 11th every year? Yes, you are all from school. You're all from school every November 11th. What holiday do we? Correct. Excellent. Veterans Day. Veterans Day is a holiday that stemmed from this ceasefire armistice agreement. Now, if I was teaching history in 1930, we would not know it as Veterans Day, November 11th. We would know it as Armistice Day. Okay? Armistice Day was naively meant to be the day. It was meant to be the day where the last war was ever fought. Many people believe that World War I was such a horrific and bad war that there would never be another war fought in world history. Now, World War I is a horrible, horrible war, one of the worst in world history. But it's not the last war the world ever fights. Okay, because we know that World War II happens. So they had to change the name. We changed it to Veterans Day. So it became a national holiday first as Armistice Day, and then it was changed to Veterans Day because we couldn't really celebrate a day that was meant to end all wars, yet we've had other wars. So we've changed it to Veterans Day, which is a day we basically recognize any military officer who has served in our military, and we recognize them and honor them. Okay? But it was signed on November 11th, 1918, and we turned it into a holiday and then changed the name from Armistice Day to Veterans Day. So I wanted to share that. All right. Last thing I'd like to do, okay, last thing I'd like to do is leave you with this kind of chart. Can you just let me know in the chat, can you see my mouse? You guys see my mouse? Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I want to take a look at the top left here. Okay, I want to take a look at the top left. So total number of troops mobilized. The Allied powers had 42 million troops that fought in World War I, compared to the Central Powers that only had 23 million. So yes, I would definitely say the Allied powers having more troops definitely helped. Okay, the group that had the most soldiers killed was Germany. They had 1.8 million soldiers killed. Russia had the most for the Allied powers, had 1.7 million, but remember, they weren't in the war for the entire time. They were only in the war for about 3/4 of the time. France had 1.3 million. Austria-Hungary 1.2, and British just under a million. Now, if you see the United States, it's almost barely recognizable that they had 116,000 American soldiers killed. That is a ton of soldiers, don't get me wrong. But comparatively to the rest of the world, it wasn't very much. So America's impact in World War One, though it was very big towards the end of the war, wasn't very big in terms of the amount of soldiers that they committed and lost to this war. Okay. And a big reason why I'm showing you this is if you kind of add them together 1.8, 1.7, 1.3, all told, it's right around 11 million deaths for World War One. Okay, which is at this point the most amount of people killed in a war in any war in world history. So this was devastating beyond comprehension. Now I want to just leave this with you here. Take a look at World War II. One country, the Soviet Union, had 13.6 million people killed. That's just one country. So as bad as World War I is, World War II is a lot worse. It's a lot worse. So World War I is horrible. It becomes the second deadliest war in world history after World War II. So a lot of students, when we learn about World War II, a lot more students tend to remember World War II more than World War I because World War II was more deadly and had a lot more even crazier things happen than we saw in World War I. But I want to kind of leave that with you to kind of show you how deadly these wars actually were. The Civil War for the United States, we lost 850,000 people. All right? That is comparatively in World War I, like just a fraction. Okay, it's like 10% of the amount of soldiers lost. All right, in the Civil War, we saw how crazy and deadly it was. So I really can never do it justice by just throwing a chart up here, but this is kind of showing you how crazy this war was with over 8 million people being killed. All right, also a big thing during World War I is 86% of the people killed in World War I were military personnel. So these are the soldiers, these are the generals. There's still 14% of the people that were killed were regular civilians that were injured from a stray bullet, a bomb, whatever. Civilians are basically people that are not fighting as soldiers in the World War. What even makes World War II even crazier is more than half of the people killed in World War II were innocent people. And this is going to show you how crazy the weapons were in World War II, even more so than World War I. So as bad as World War I is, I want to kind of mention to you, like, there's a much worse war coming, okay, that you're going to learn about in a month or two. All right, so I wanted to really emphasize that and make that clear. What we're going to do for the rest of the class is we're going to watch World War I Oversimplified Part 2. So we're not done with World War I because we still have to go over the treaties, which was a huge moment, and a couple of other things, but we definitely want to wrap up kind of the second part of the war. So everyone open up that Google Doc that is shared on the Google Classroom. The Google Doc consists of, I think, 10 questions, sorry. Consists of 10 questions that we're going to go through together. I don't love this oversimplified video because I actually think it goes way too fast, but, you know, it's something that you could pick up maybe a couple things on. We're basically looking at World War I from the years 1916 to 1918. We last left off on the video basically with America starting to kind of get involved, but this is going to go over the sinking of Lusitania, the Zimmerman Telegram, and a lot of the battles that we kind of looked at, and basically seeing how the Allied powers broke through and won World War I. I should also probably mention, ladies and gentlemen, that they're going to mention some battles from some other countries that aren't necessarily so important. They're good to know, but like just watch and pick up what you can and obviously answer the questions as they go on. Please preview questions 1 and 2 before we go over them here in the chat.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down. The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions, and the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long, grueling war, though, so they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number 1, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea. The Allies also also clicked on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans. Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides. Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war. The Central Powers' new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottoman were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join.
Okay, so number one, what does it mean that country tries to fight on new fronts? Basically means they are trying to fight. I don't know why I put this in caps, sorry. They are trying to fight different areas around the world. Okay, that's number one. They're trying to fight in different areas in the world. You'll learn this fronts, okay, having a front at this point in time when we get into some, especially World War II. But basically means you're fighting in different areas around the world, all right? Number two, what does stalemate mean? Well, if you play chess, you know that the stalemate means that there's no clear winner, otherwise known as a tie. Okay, and that is a lot of World War I. There's no clear winner to start. All right, for like the first 3 years, like no one could really tell who's going to win the war. Where in like certain wars, you can kind of tell like it's all going to be over soon, like one side's going to win. This is not the case in World War I. They really couldn't tell who was winning, and we needed some things to kind of break the stalemate. All right, please take a look at questions 3 and 4.
Went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back and said, whoops, looks like we're at war now. The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to death. Then they crossed miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed. The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory, and the resulting Armenian genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people. Then the Germans sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against the British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan. All these new frontiers hadn't done much to change the war. Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used submarines to sink civilian ships. One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying US opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians, many of whom escaped by sea. It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list. Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit. Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides...
Okay, so number 3, who did the Ottomans blame for their loss? They blamed a group called the Armenians, which leads to the Armenian genocide, which is a horrible, horrible situation you'll learn about in 10th grade, where basically the Ottomans try to wipe out any people who are of Armenian descent because they blame for their World War I losses. That's something I'm kind of just mentioning in passing, but is a horrible situation. All right, but you'll learn about that in 10th grade. That is a world history thing. What new types of warfare did Germany introduce into this world war? That would be chemical warfare. Yeah, not good, because chemical warfare is supposed to be illegal. We see how deadly it is. We saw it with the chlorine gas last time. This was, if someone got chemical warfare, people died a very slow and painful death. All right, not good. All right, number 5, where was one of the longest and deadliest battles of World War I? And then also take a look at number 6.
Had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle, so they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't try that again. The UK started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day. It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology. The Russians had been getting pushed back further and further into their own territory, but in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war, and then they got pounded. The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies.
Okay, before we go into what's going on with Greece, where was one of the longest battles, deadliest battles of World War I? That would be the Battle of the Somme. And it's a big battle you learn about in when we get to World History class in 10th grade. Number 6, what weapon did the British introduce for the first time? That would be tanks. We start to see them after the Battle of the Somme. I know we saw them in the movie 1917. That would be after the Battle of the Somme, so that is historically accurate. All right. We're going to look at Greece a little bit, like how they kind of contributed, though it's not like a huge thing you need to know. And then please take a look at number 7 and 8.
After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields, and they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad, but the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply lines. By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating, and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling some of the shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd complete with riots and strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution, and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government, and they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like...
Okay, so number 7, where did the British and Ottomans do most of their fighting? A little bit different. They didn't fight in the trenches. They fought in desert. Deserts in the Middle East, really. Guess we'll put that. Much different type of fighting. If you ever heard of Lawrence of Arabia, that's where he gets his name, is from World War I. And we should know from the notes already that Russia leaves because of the Russian Revolution. Russia leaves the war because of the Russian Revolution. Okay. Number 9 and number 10 are coming up now as the video ends.
Like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, "Wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America?" But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe. This was terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived. It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time further north, then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks. By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable suffering and millions dead, the world learnt its lesson and never had such an awful war again. For about 20 years.
Okay, that's where this video ends. It is very quick. It is very oversimplified, but it's a good little way to kind of get a sense of what happened for World War I towards the end. Why did America start shipping out soldiers into World War I? We should know that already. The Zimmerman telegram was received. Okay, once they heard that Germany was trying to take away American states and starting up submarine warfare again, that would lead to that. And then number 10, what did the Treaty of Versailles say? So we're going to learn about the Treaty of Versailles in length tomorrow, next time I see you. So the Treaty of Versailles basically blamed Germany for World War I, forced them to take blame. Now that is very oversimplified. You'll learn a lot more that it does. I just don't want to ruin it for, I think I see you guys next on Wednesday. So let me say a couple things before I let you go. For you guys, I will see you all on Wednesday. I don't see you guys tomorrow. So that means you guys, I see you all Wednesday, normal time. I think I see 8A6, 8th period, and 8D6, 6th period. So that's that. If you guys have answered all the questions and you have followed along with me, you guys could turn it in and you can go. This should be a very easy classwork grade. And yeah, that should be it. So you guys can go and have a good rest of your day.
Bye, Penio. Bye, everyone. I'll see you in ELA.